Uh,
Uh, the whole idea of internationally what's happening around reorienting, there are two different ways of thinking about internationally. One would be what's happening in other countries, and the other is what's happening on the UN stage and so on. So, in other countries, for instance, in trying to reorient, China has developed 1,000 experimental ESD schools looking at global citizenship, education for sustainable development, and even reorienting the whole concept of sustainable development around ecological civilization. So trying to tailor it to the Chinese mindset of civilizations and so on. In the Asia Pacific region, and I'll come back to that, where uh, led by Okayama University, you have about 18 or 20 countries with teacher education institutions working collaboratively to develop competencies of teachers. There's all kinds of work around the competencies of students, but what are the competencies that in initial teacher education? The International Association of Universities has developed a program to react to the Sustainable Development Goals, putting together clusters representing all the different UN regions of the world of universities working on each of the individual clusters. And Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education is being led by our university and in particular our chair. So SDG 4 and so on. And I may be able to have time to come back to that. One of the really big things, though, that's happening internationally is the Times Higher Education ranking. However you feel about ranking, it has really finally the attention of higher administration. And as I say, whether you like it or not. So internationally, from institutions, there are two big movements. One is linked to the SDGs, right? That's me. And the other is linked to quality education itself. So those are two big sectors. So, and I'm going to talk about the SDG drivers first, and then I'll come back to the other. So I'll just take a moment and try and share my screen here because, yesterday was International Day of Education. Now, what is different about this is a full UN day. This is not a UNESCO day. It's only 3 years old. It was developed 3 years ago. And the focus is on promoting peace and sustainable development. Because the full UN, the UN General Assembly now, is engaged with trying to bring purpose to education. And that's very, very different, and it's around purpose around sustainable development. Now, if very quickly, I think the term reorienting, that goes right back to the very beginning with the different ways in which sustainable development, whether it was right after the Second World War, looking at the role of education in trying to rebuild and try and shape the future. But from our perspective, we usually talk about 1987, when the full UN General Assembly adopted sustainable development as the big compromise between the North wanting environmental protection and the South wanting development, roughly. And then for 5 years, they worked on an implementation plan, which was called Agenda 21. And in Agenda 21, there were 40 chapters, 40 issues. Chapter 36 was using education, public awareness, and training as a means of implementing. And in looking at the roles, they took education and split it into two. So we had education, public awareness, and training with four sort of thrusts or aspects. And the first one was more education, education for all. Without education, an educated society wouldn't have any development, let alone, sustainable. But they realized it was our most educated nations that were creating a lot of the greatest problems. So the idea then was introduced. I was part of the writing team. There were a ton of us. And what we wanted to do was to reorient the purpose of education from development, a whole economic base, to sustainable development. And so while the first thrust was access and retention in quality education, the second one was reorienting the purpose of education itself. The third thrust was public awareness and understanding, and the fourth was training programs. Now, Agenda 21 ran until we had the opportunity of a new kickstart with the millennium. And so we then changed from the 40 thrusts down to 8. But still education, but from a perspective of more access was it, and it was only targeted to the least developing countries. That ran from 2000 to 2015, a 15-year block. We started to prepare for the next block, and we realized that just working on the least developed countries wouldn't work. The idea that we needed to address all nations. And we needed, again, to look at education for all. And so in 2012 to 2015, there was a short campaign called Global Education Initiative that came out, and it looked at, yes, more, second, reorienting, right? And the third, global citizenship perspectives. And that went into 2015 to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then when you get into parallel, you can see very quickly in 1990, we had education for all. In 2000, we had the Millennium Development Goals for the least. And then in 2015, with the Sustainable Development Goals, we've blended the two thrusts together. Education for all has been subsumed into the Sustainable Development Goals as it goes along. Now, the way of looking at education, for instance, as an enabler of them all, and I'll come back to this again in a second, but you can't look at the Sustainable Development Goals in isolation. It's like a patchwork blanket or quilt. One patch doesn't really help you on a cold night. You need the whole integrated approach. And so if you take COVID, you can see this slide put out by the UN General Assembly, really pushing that we look in an integrated way with them. And none is more integrated than the role of education. So if you look at education itself, yes, we have the one, but it is part of them all. And the other thing is in a context now of not just three things of social, environmental, and economic, but now it's the social becomes people, the economic becomes prosperity, the environmental becomes planet, and then to that we see this cannot be done just by government. So the whole idea of partnerships, which includes NGOs like Ubuntu and so on. And then the goal of looking at peace. Now, within Sustainable Development Goal 4, there are 7 targets and 3 means of implementation. And you're saying, okay, what does this do really with teacher education? One, which you can look at is 4.10, which really is called C, is increasing the number of teachers. But within 4.7, it's interesting that they identify the knowledge and skill for sustainable development. And in that, it identifies at 4.7, if you go into it, the actual UN document identifies education for sustainable development, including sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, etc., and global citizenship. The UN doesn't mention math, language, history, geography, that sort of thing. But these are key issues because they are a means of implementation. But the UN General Assembly has also recognized on two occasions, in 2017 and 2019, that education for sustainable development, not just education itself, but reaffirms education for sustainable development as a vital means of implementation, but also as an integral element of the Sustainable Development Goal on quality education and a key enabler of all the other Sustainable Development Goals. So this hoists it really up in importance. So these two had been moving along in parallel, and now they're being brought together. It's fine if you have those with a background in global citizenship education and those who have a background and so on, they can continue to work on it. But from the perspective of the classroom teacher or the professor, you can't bring in these 100 different adjectival educations that are floating around out there. I know superintendent curriculum, my job was to try and keep them out of the curriculum so people could focus, right? So how do we blend these together and bring them in an integrated way and bring them to the attention and of our school systems?